This box contains, or at least it should contain, a copy of the 2020 New American Standard Bible, large print, ultra-thin. It is in maroon leather flex, or some imitation leather. So we'll see what we actually received. So here's the Bible. It does not have a box. It has paper, sort of a slip cover. So let's see if we can get it open. Okay, with the plastic off, we'll take a look at the back. That's supposed to be the font size. There is the ISBN, and what it features, and a very short description of the update. In this video, we'll take a quick look at this 2020 NASB Lockman large print ultra-thin Bible. Then we'll talk a bit about my observations about the 2020 edition. As you can see, compared to a 1995 large print ultra-thin, printed in about 2013, it's essentially the same size. This newer one is in leather text, the old one is in genuine leather. It has roughly the same footprint as a recently printed MacArthur Study Bible with a 1995 text and a comfort print font, but of course it's much thinner. This book is 9 5/8 inches tall, 7 inches wide, and 1 1/4 inches thick. I got the maroon leather text. I believe it's also available in black and brown. The text is formatted into 2 columns. Each column is 60 millimeters wide. There are around 38 characters per line and as many as 57 lines of text. So if you go back to the book of Numbers, you'll probably find a column with 57 lines of text in it. You can see that the right-hand edge is not justified. It's sort of ragged looking. That's similar to the New Revised Standard Version 5th edition New Oxford Annotated Bible. The page dimensions are 232.5 millimeters tall and 165 millimeters wide. They're 25.4 millimeters in an inch, so that makes it 9.15 inches tall, 6.5 inches wide. The text is line matched. You can see that in places like that, where you can see the print from the opposite page lined up perfectly with the print on this page. It appears fairly sharp and somewhat bold. The margins are somewhat narrow at the top here. They're 9 to 11 millimeters. The inner margin can be as much as 14. The outer margin ranges between 11 and 13 millimeters. And at the bottom of the page, from the bottom to the edge, is typically 5 to 6 millimeters. It's much larger than that here, but about 5 to 6 millimeters on this page. I compared the font and the text to Times New Roman. Capital letters are about the same size as a 10.5 point Times New Roman. Lowercase letters are closer to an 11 point Times New Roman. Advertised font is 10 points. The line height is 3.8 millimeters, which means that it is about 10.8 points in height. So it's properly adjusted to the size of the characters. Verse numbers are in black, and they are within the paragraphs themselves, so they're fairly easy to spot. Added words that the translator adds for smoothing are in italic font, typically. Pronouns for deity in the New American Standard Bible are capitalized, so they did not change that in the 2020 edition. There are center column references. They're in column order, which means they follow the left-hand column, and then at a certain point down the page, they begin to follow the right-hand column. So references that go with the upper right are typically down in the center and below on the page. The font here is a 7-point font. It's a sans serif. The New American Standard Bible's text and translation notes are at the bottom of the page. They are also in a 7-point sans serif font, and the back of the slip cover indicates that all of the notes are here. So this is not one with a truncated set of text or translation notes. The paper has a sheet thickness of about 34 micrometers, which makes me estimate the paper weight at about 31 GSM, Maybe it's 30, maybe it's 28, maybe it's 32. There's only a light sheen on the surface, so it's not as glossy as some Bibles you'll find, which is an advantage. It's better to have a diffuse reflection on the paper. Unfortunately, the paper is blue. I think you can see that there. It would be better if it were not blue, in my opinion. There is significant show-through, but certainly the line matching helps. So you can see the show-through coming from the opposite side of the page. Here's an example of the print non-uniformity, that is the variation in print darkness that I've seen. Page 995 on the left is quite a bit darker than page 997 on the right. It is noticeable, but I have not noticed it very frequently in this edition. There are no book introductions at the beginning of each book. The book introductions are in a separate section that I will show you in just a moment. Book titles and page contents are in the outside top corners of each page. Page numbers are at the center top. Headings in the text are in an 8-point font in all capitals, and as you can see here, the words of Christ in this edition are printed in black ink, the way I prefer them. Chapter numbers are large and bold. They span about 2 lines of text. As far as I've been able to tell, each book of the Bible begins on a fresh page. The 2020 edition of the New American Standard Bible has retained the practice of printing quotations from the Old Testament in all capitals. Sometimes they are indented, as here. Sometimes they are not. After the end of the book of Revelation, you will find a blank page on the opposite side of the print, and then you will find a 126-page, 2-column New American Standard Bible Topical Index of both Testaments. It is printed in about a 9-point font. The book introductions appear after the Topical Index. It's about an 11-page, 2-column section, and the font here is about 10.5 points. The book introduction section is followed by a 4-page section that contains a list of the parables of Jesus, the miracles of Jesus, and important events in the life, Christ's life in the gospel. So that's 4 pages altogether, and that is in about a 9 to 10-point font. The maps are color maps in somewhat subdued colors. They span 8 pages, and there are 9 of these maps altogether. They are printed on a glossy, heavier paper than the Bible itself. It's not a high gloss paper, but it definitely does reflect. These maps do not enter the gutter. Between maps 4 and 5, or rather 5 and 6, well, here you can see the thread between 4 and 5 fairly well. It's definitely a sewn binding. 2 maps here, map 6A and 6B, and then map 8, which is the 9th map, has to do with Paul's missionary journeys. After that you have the liner. It's a synthetic or it's some sort of coated paper, I'm not sure which, dark brown, and you have the leather text cover. Here's the spine. There are 2 ribbon markers. Ribbon markers are 9 millimeters wide. They're 33.2 millimeters long. They are placed crooked, so they don't come quite out of the text block straight. They are long enough to use at the diagonal corners of the paper. They're single-face satin, so they're shiny on one side and not quite so shiny on the other. There are dark brown head and tail bands. The Bible does lie open and reasonably flat in Genesis and in Revelation. In the center of the volume, as you get deeper into it, you do notice some drop-off, but it's relatively easy to adjust the book so that you can have a flat reading surface. In front you see the same liner, then you see a presentation page, a blank sheet, place to record marriages, the wife's family tree, the husband's tree, births, deaths, occasions to remember, and then you come to the title page. Here's the copyright page. This is the large print Ultrathin. It is the 2020 edition. It has typesetting by 2K Denmark, and it's printed in the People's Republic of China. This is the first printing. Somewhat curiously, there are two tables of contents. This one includes this material we've been looking at the beginning, then Old Testament and New Testament books. If you turn the page, you find the books of the Bible, so the same contents essentially, only what's different here is that it gives you abbreviations for those books. The next page is the foreword to the New American Standard Bible, which goes for 3 pages, a page of explanation of format, and then abbreviations and special markings, and you're in the Old Testament. The foreword does talk about some changes they've made in order to implement what they call gender accuracy, so I'll let you read this, and then we'll go to the next page to continue the paragraph. They point out accurately that men was never intended to be gender exclusive when the context indicated that women were included. Greek and Hebrew words that are not actually exclusive in gender, as they were used in a general context, are rendered by inclusive terms such as people. So that's one of the changes they made in this edition. The next paragraph is on the word brethren. They no longer use brethren. And I've in other videos pointed out that I really don't agree with their logic here of printing "and sisters" in italics. It seems to me that if the word Adelphi means brothers and sisters, then "and sisters" is not needed. If it means brothers only, then Paul was capable, he knew Greek, and he knew that there's a Greek word for and there's a Greek word, it's a plural word that can be used for sisters. So if he had meant brothers and sisters, and the word Adelphi doesn't mean brothers and sisters, he could have written "and sisters" in there. All that said, I actually have come to the point where I like "and sisters," because it gives the reader then the option of, on his or her own, deciding whether Adelphi in the context means brothers only or both brothers and sisters. Next, there's a change that I'm not all that excited about, let's for let us. I would prefer that they had retained let us, but they've made the choice to introduce a contraction and make the language a little bit less formal. I'll let you see the rest of that paragraph. Here's a word about the Hebrew text that they translated. Here's a similar paragraph about the Greek text. They say that they used the 28th edition of Nestle-Aland, but they say they gave consideration to it. And as you'll see on my charts, they did pay a little bit more heed to the Nestle-Aland text than they did in earlier editions. In terms of the abbreviations and special markings, you'll notice that this edition includes double brackets. If you look, say, at the earlier edition in the same place, they only used the single brackets, so that is new. Double brackets in the text mean that those words are very likely not in the original manuscripts. That is similar to the way the Nestle-Aland text defines double brackets. For them, double brackets in the text indicate that the enclosed words are known not to be part of the original text. So Nestle-Aland is a bit stronger in its meaning than the New American Standard Bible is for double brackets, but single brackets, it's rather different. Here they say the brackets, single brackets, indicate the words are probably not in the original manuscripts. That's quite a lot stronger than what Nestle-Aland says. They say that single brackets indicate that textual critics today are not completely convinced of the authenticity of the enclosed words. So having doubt here, but in the New American Standard Bible, single brackets indicate probably not in the original manuscripts. Here we're attempting to compare the font of the 95 Lockman NASB large print ultrathin with that of the 2020 edition that we're reviewing here today. The 2020 edition has a somewhat larger font. It is, in terms of line spacing, I think it's more generous line spacing as well. I like the paper on my 2013 printed 1995 edition quite a lot better. And there I think you can see a difference in the translation here at Exodus 35:10. And as you see, the font is quite a lot larger than that in the MacArthur Study Bible on the left. On the translation continuum chart that you see here, the 2020 edition scores as less free, more literal than the 1995 edition. And you might wonder why. So let's look at a few examples, starting here with Revelation chapter 13, verse 1. In the 1977 edition, it read correctly, "And he stood on the sand of the seashore." So there was no the dragon in there. There's a note there that indicates that some manuscripts say I rather than he. Then in the 1995 edition, the dragon was inserted in that verse without any notes, without italics. So clearly, since the dragon is not in the text, having it this way, as in the 2020 edition, is more literal than the 1995 edition. Another example here is at Matthew 10:1. If you look at the Greek text, you do not see the name Jesus there, nor does it appear in the apparatus down below. So it's not in the Greek. Jesus was not used in the 1977 edition. It appeared in the 1995 edition without footnote, without italics, so that's definitely a liberty. The 2020 edition, by using italics, reduced or removed that liberty. So in that case, it is definitely a more literal translation than the 95. One last example on this point, if you look at Romans 2:21 and 22, you will see numerous places, at least 4, where the word you appears in italics. That's because there's nothing corresponding to you in the Greek. It's implied, but it's not actually present. If you look at the 95 edition, you do not see those instances in italic font. It's also easy to find instances like here at Luke 17:1, where the 2020 edition restores introductory conjunctions that were deleted in the 1995 edition. I looked at the Old Testament and 100 different verses where there are variants, and I noticed a couple of places where the 2020 edition differs from the 1995. One of them is here in Psalm 145, where the 13th verse ends with "throughout all generations." The 2020 edition has added in the line, "The Lord is faithful in all his works, and holy and faithful in all his words, and holy in all his works." This is an acrostic psalm, and that addition makes the psalm then fulfill all the letters. It has material for all the letters in the Hebrew alphabet. So I'm glad to see that they added that in. If you look here at the chart, you'll see that the New American Standard 20 is a couple of points to the right of the 95. I will show you another instance of where the 2020 edition departed from the Masoretic Text. So that change in Psalm 145 is due to the 2020 edition following the Septuagint. Here in the 95 edition in Isaiah 49:12, you see the word "sewn." If you look at the 2020 edition, it says "aswan." That is because the 2020 edition is following the Dead Sea Scrolls here. They did not, however, add a footnote to mark that point. In terms of the New Testament textual basis, I looked at the 153 verses that I commonly examine, and it scored as follows. Here it is shown with Nestle-Aland on the y-axis and Robinson-Pierpont on the x-axis. It shows a little more affinity to Nestle-Aland than did NAS 95 or NAS 77, which are below the red rectangle there. It shows very little affinity to Robinson-Pierpont's majority text. Next chart is has Westcott and Hort on the x-axis, and you see NAS 20 over there in the red rectangle on the right. It is a bit more Westcott and Hort-like than the 95 edition was, but not quite as much as the 77 edition was. And this final chart shows that the Tyndale House Greek New Testament, which was printed in 2017, seems to have had little influence on the textual decisions of the NAS 20. The fact that the NAS 2020 agrees with Nestle-Aland only 64.1% of the time shows that they exerted quite a bit of independence of the source text, that they acted as textual critics on their own. So in practical terms, what do those changes look like? I'll show you three charts that list some of them. Rather than having descend into Hades in Matthew 11:23, it now reads will be brought down to Hades. Deleted or his mother in Matthew 15:6, although it placed that in italics. If you look down towards the bottom, there are passages in Luke that are now in brackets that were not formerly. And Luke 10:1 now reads 72 rather than 70. One of the curiosities about the 1995 edition and earlier editions was that it appended this material at the end of Hebrews 2:7, which is now gone. And then in 2 Peter 3:10, the 2020 edition reads, the earth and its works will be discovered, whereas the earlier editions had the earth and its works being burned up. Next, I want to show you a few charts that just show differences in renderings that have nothing to do with the source text. So here's Galatians 5:4. The 2020 edition capitalizes the law, which was not capitalized previously. You see a change there in 2 Peter 2:6. One of the thems there is now in italics, which means that the 2020 edition had one fewer liberties in that point. And you see the difference in the ending there. To those who would live ungodly lives thereafter became an example of what is coming for the ungodly. The Greek source is the same, but the translation changed. This chart shows differences in Revelation 4:8. The 2020 edition corrected an error in the 1995 edition, which had the end of Revelation 4:8 as part of the quotation from the Old Testament, which it is not. Acts 26:25, you see there, I am speaking out with truthful and rational words, instead of I utter words of sober truth. I think utter and sober were probably thought by the style police to be awkward. Cut to the quick became infuriated. And this one's odd to me because it's actually less literal. I think the Greek word really most literally means arose, although it can imply got ready. In John 7:50 you see a curious change because Nicodemus clearly was a he, and yet the 2020 edition changed he who to the one who. I'm not sure why. We'll talk about the gender changes in a bit. I have a few charts on that. John 4:20, you people became you Jews. Men ought to worship became one must worship. Romans 2:25. This is an interesting change. Why would violator be better than transgressor? I think again that's because the word transgressor may be thought to be too rare. Here's an improvement. Mark 8:6. Recline clearly brings out the sense of the Greek better, I believe, than sit down. A few more changes in John. Bridegroom is now groom. Proceeded forth became came forth. Homestead became residence. Pledge was replaced by first installment. Begotten by fathered. Bosom by arms. I think bosom was better. This small change in 1 Corinthians 3:19 throws the verse in a different light in my mind. 1 Corinthians 8:7 changes men to people, but men was used in an inclusive way, I believe, in the original, so both are appropriate. I don't like the change at 1 Corinthians 13:10, done away with. Strikes me as awkward. And other changes, tutor is now guardian, and unfortunately let us is now let's. One last chart on this theme, plucked out is now torn out, slain is replaced by slaughtered, robbers are now rebels, and reprove, which may be too hard for people to understand these days, is now rebuke. So we talked a bit about the gender accurate approach as described in the preface earlier. Here are a few charts that I've modified from a video that I made recently that compared the gender-inclusive approaches of the 2011 New International Version with those of the 1989 New Revised Standard Version. And the point of these modified charts is to show you that the 2020 New American Standard Version is not in the same league. It doesn't have the same approach or philosophy, certainly as the New Revised Standard Version, or even as in the much more mild 2011 New International Version. Here in John 14:23, both the 95 and the 2020 had anyone rather than he who or anything with a male pronoun in it, and then they both retain the masculine pronouns down below, which the NIV and the New Revised Standard Version replace with them. In 1 Corinthians 14:4, they both have himself, where the NIV and the New Revised Standard Version get rid of him in favor of them. In John 11:25, the 2020 edition replaced he who believes with the one who believes, but that's the kind of change you see in the English Standard Version as well. It has he dies below, where both the NIV and the New Revised Standard Version have they die. In Romans 4:5, both the 95 and the 2020 New American Standards have his above, where the New Revised Standard Version and the NIV replace that his, one with their and the other one with such. In Luke 6:29, both New American Standard translations have him in places where that word is removed by the New Revised Standard Version and the New International Version. In Luke 10:6, both the 95 and the 2020 editions have man of peace, where son of peace is a better reading, but it's in a footnote. Both have him later in the verse, where the NIV has them and the NRSV has that person to avoid the masculine pronouns. In Luke 20:36, the 2020 editions continues to have the word sons, which apparently is offensive to the NIV and the NRSV, which changed that to children. In 1 John 5:16, the first half of the verse, both the 2020 and the 95 have masculine pronouns. The big difference is the 2020 adds or sister in keeping with its philosophy. But it doesn't do what the 2011 NIV or the 1989 New Revised Standard Version do, which is to reconstruct the verse into second person in order to avoid using words like he and him. In Luke 6:42, first half of the verse, both translations have brother early on. The difference in purple that I show there is due to a textual variant. The New Revised Standard Version put in neighbor and friend to avoid using brother. Here in Acts 6:3, you do see a change. Brethren becomes brothers and sisters, as indicated in the preface. But it doesn't do what the New Revised Standard Version does, which is to replace brethren with friends. Matthew 18:15 is another example of where the 2020 edition restores an introductory conjunction that the 95 deleted. Otherwise, it seems to be very similar to the 95 edition in terms of a gender approach, and different from that of the NIV or the New Revised Standard Version. Mark 2:27, the two translations, the New American Standard translations, are identical, apart from correcting a footnote that seems to have been botched in the 95 edition, but they both retain man, as does the NIV in this case, but the gender-inclusive New Revised Standard Version has humankind there. I think man in this case means humankind, so I don't see an issue either way. Hebrews 5:1 is somewhat curious. The 2020 edition translates the same Greek word two different ways within a few letters of each other, men and then people. It isn't clear to me why. It may be the translators understand that the word men excludes females in the first case so that they can retain a completely male priesthood. But since the priests are offering gifts for both men and women, they chose to use people later on. I think it's inconsistent. But at least they did retain men in one place, where the NIV has the people and the New Revised Standard Version has mortals. In 1 Corinthians 13:1, where the 95 edition had men, the 2020 has mankind, but I think it means the same thing. In Acts 14:14 through 15, you see that both New American Standard editions have men in both locations. They are in red, where the NIV has friends and human. NRSV has friends and mortals. And oh, by the way, here's another instance where if I had scored this verse, I would have scored fewer liberties for the 2020 than the 95, because of it is not present in the Greek. And the 2020 edition puts that in italics. Finally, on this theme, look at Romans 4:7 through 8. Both the New American Standard editions retain the man, whereas both the NIV and New Revised Standard Version avoid the man and opt for the one instead. I haven't spent a lot of time in the Old Testament, but here's an example. You're looking at the New Revised Standard Version, Daniel 7:13. I watched in the night visions. I saw one like a human being coming with the clouds of heaven, which disconnects this verse from places where it's referenced in the New Testament of Jesus, who calls himself the Son of Man. You'll see that Son of Man is retained here in the 2020 edition of the New American Standard Bible. In Psalm 2, the 1995 edition said, "How blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked." The 2020 edition changed that to the person, which does strike me as awkward. I wish they had left it unchanged, but I think it's better than the New Revised Standard Version, which says, "Happy are those who do not follow the advice of the wicked or take the path. Their delight is in the law of the Lord." So it pluralizes as it commonly does. Here is Genesis 5:1 in the New Revised Standard Version. You see it has God created humankind, and he named them humankind when they were created. The 2020 edition here has man in the first instance, and when God created man, and then it says he blessed them and named them mankind on the day when they were created. Well, I'll just make a few more miscellaneous observations before we summarize. Here in Galatians 3:22, where the 1995 had botched the footnote and had this footnote 1 read things, the footnote here, in fact, now reads all things, as it should. So everyone is literally all things and not things. But I am very pleased to see that they are replaced with a view to here in Ephesians 1:10 and in verse 1:14 with regarding and in regard to. I think it reads much better that way. Here in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 9, I wish that they had put away in italics. I think the verse can be understood in two ways. Either the eternal destruction consists in part of being away from God's presence, or it means that the eternal destruction itself comes from the presence of the Lord as a source. And I think if they put away here in italics, it would allow the reader to see that more easily. I have always thought that the translation here in 2 Peter 1:10 is somewhat awkward. They did change brethren to brothers and sisters, but the only other change I noticed that choosing became choice of. There wasn't much done to actually make the translation here more literal. Well, I'll do a quick summary here. In terms of this edition, it's relatively inexpensive. The leather text sticks to your fingers a bit, but it's not too bad. I think I could put it in a cover and use it gainfully. I believe the gilting looks nice. I think I scratched it up a bit during the review, however, with the corner of the MacArthur Study Bible. The biggest negative in my view is the blue paper. The transparency I think is acceptable, or the opacity is. It's nicely line matched. It's a nice font and it's large enough. Line spacing is good, and the paper doesn't have much of a sheen to it. All those are good things, but that blue color, I really find that annoying. Wish we could have had a different color. I think maybe it has something to do with the contrast here, decreasing the contrast with the print, with the blue background. These ribbon markers are relatively nice, nice and wide, which keeps them from folding, which is a good thing. You have a good index in the back and nice maps, so for relatively inexpensive cost, it's a good addition. In terms of the translation, I'm not enthusiastic in terms of gender-inclusive language, but I think that this is actually quite mild. I understand what they're trying to do with brethren going to brothers and sisters, and the fact that they put in sisters in italics allows you to read it as brothers if you wish, knowing that the italics is the translator's interpretation of what is meant. My hope, however, is that women don't feel patronized by having "and sisters" or "sister" in italics. The other changes strike me as quite mild. I know I've had some conversations with people in the comment sections of videos who are annoyed by them, but frankly my opinion is that they're largely minor in terms of the gender issues. I really prefer more formal language in the Bible translations I read, and a lot of the changes that they've made here, like clothing instead of garments, fathered instead of begotten, silence instead of hush, servant instead of minister, infuriated instead of cut to the quick. We saw groom instead of bridegroom, demanding man instead of exacting man, complimented for praised, wants for wishes, grave becomes tomb, loving kindness gets replaced with favor, witness becomes testimony. I'm not sure a lot of those are needed. Implored is replaced with pleaded with. There's some good things like restoring behold to the text in Matthew 2:1. So it's something of a mixed bag. I'm glad to see that the use of italics is more rigorous and thoroughgoing. I'm glad that they corrected some of the footnotes in the 95 edition, which had been botched. And overall, I give it a thumbs up. I think it's an acceptable piece of work. So thanks very much for watching the video. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, please hit the like button. And if you haven't already done so, I encourage you to subscribe to the channel. Thanks again for watching.